Greetings. My name is Matthew Harvey, and I'm president of the board of Fort Des Moines Museum and Education Center. And I'd like to thank you so much for participating in our first ever virtual fundraising event. I know it's been longer than we had hoped to present this program to you, but the volunteers that worked on it, I think they've done a good job. And I'd like to express my appreciation to them. And more so, I'd like to express my appreciation to you for your patience and your commitment to supporting Fort Des Moines Museum and Education Center. Please enjoy the program.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the virtual Fort Des Moines Museum fundraising dinner. I'm your host, Hadley Harvey, and I can't wait to share the importance of this event with you tonight. We would like to start off by thanking our main sponsors, Detroit Architect, where I am here now, and the Des Moines chapter of the NAACP. We would also like to thank those who participated in the making of the video: Hannah Harvey, Paul Tyler, Mark Vukovic, Lacey Opdyke, and Carlton Philpott. We would also like to thank all you supporters of the museum, and thank you for the work that you have done for our museum and community. Both my parents were a part of the military. My mom, a dental officer in both Michigan and Iowa National Guard, and my dad, an infantry and contracting officer with over 25 years of Army Reserve service. Being that my parents were involved in the military and believed in the museum message, it was clear why my dad had been volunteering with the museum for the last 8 years. The Fort Des Moines Museum and Education Center mission is to preserve, promote, and perpetuate the sacrifice and service of the Black officers of World War I and Women's Army Corps WAC of World War II, and that all others whose lives have been connected to Fort Des Moines. The museum believes that inspiring others to change the world honors all those associated with the Fort Des Moines, veterans and civilians, who once served at the fort. Leadership development is, and always has been, the here of the Fort Des Moines Museum. As such, the values of the Fort Des Moines Museum and Educational Center Board of Directors reflect the same values taught to those leaders previously trained at the Fort Des Moines. The main values of the Fort Des Moines Museum are loyalty, duty, respect, selflessness, honor, integrity, and personal courage.
Hello, my name is Hannah Harvey, and I'm also the daughter of Matthew and Haley Harvey. My dad left when I was 2 and got back from Afghanistan a couple months later, right before my 4th birthday. I remember him missing my 3rd birthday, and I still remind him of this as often as I can. I appreciate all my dad and mom have done for our country and community, and all the efforts of everyone else who has been a part of the museum and the preservation of its legacy. I remember when I was in the 8th grade and I made a video on the Fort Des Moines for my government class.
Welcome, students, teachers, and family members to the Fort Des Moines Museum. My name is Hannah Harvey, and in this short video, I will be teaching you about the fort and giving you reasons why you should come. The Fort Des Moines Museum is a museum that can bring alive what you are taught in social studies and government classes, focusing on the training of African American soldiers in World War I and female soldiers in World War II. Clayton Hall houses the museum's artifacts, some over 100 years old. The museum's grounds extend from Clayton Hall to the chapel.
Thank you, Hannah, for that amazing story. I too was a child when Dad went off for duty. When I was younger, our dad went on a contracting tour in nearby Omaha, Nebraska for a year. I saw him every weekend, which is a lot more than Hannah saw him. I remember how some weekends we would drive up to see him, and one time we even got to take a train. Like Hannah, I was a part of a video for the fort. I filmed most of the massing of the colors video and edited it in 8th grade during the pandemic. Massing of the colors is a patriotic ceremony held to rededicate our faith in the United States and to present our support to the national colors and the servicemen and servicewomen those colors represent.
fellow in the American College of Real Estate Lawyers, is AB rated by Martindale Hubbell and top ranked by Chambers and Partners, Best Lawyers, and Super Lawyers.
He has served as primary legal counsel to a broad variety of business entities and individuals, and as local counsel to numerous national and international businesses.
He has had a big impact as Dolls Trust trustee
and has encouraged many partnerships to advance the museum.
Okay. Why is Fort Des Moines Museum and Education Center important to you?
Well, there's a variety of reasons, but probably the most important one to me, that's very personal, is that my father was a young man, believe it or not, in 1917, and he was appointed a sergeant in the regular Army Medical Corps and was told to report to Fort Des Moines, where he would be helping indoctrinate, teach, whatever you want to call it, young Black officers and Black doctors and orderlies. And that's what he did. And so my father died when I was 3, actually quite a few years later, but he was older when I was born. But I never really got to talk to him about this. So it was obviously something that was very important to him in his life. And so I thought, well, maybe I learn a little bit about him by learning a little bit about the fort. So that's why I was attracted to it.
What do you think the museum offers to the community?
Well, it has an array of interesting items and an interesting perspective on 2 events in particular that were very important to our nation. The first being the first training center for Black officers in World War I, first training center anytime for Black officers. And then secondly, not that many years later, it became the largest center for training of women in the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, as it was called back in those days, the WAACs. And so those are 2 very important things in American history. And it's a rich resource for us to have here in Des Moines to get a little insight into those events.
What are your hopes for the future of the museum?
Well, my hope is that they can get themselves into a situation where they can have some regular hours. And I think they would be well advised to see if they couldn't find a bunch of people, perhaps most likely from the class of veterans, who would be willing to be trained to be, I think, what's generally called a docent in a museum. And that would be a large enough group of people that they could be open longer hours, and these volunteers would only have to show up occasionally to be there to help people understand the museum and take them on guided tours and that type of thing. And it would lift some of the burden off the board members who have enough to do without also being required to conduct all the tours and that type of thing. So I've encouraged them to say, go out to the American Legion and the VFW and places like that, or maybe even to, like Drake or other places, and find people who would willing to be trained to be a docent and thereby be able to extend your hours.
Fort Des Moines Museum and Education Center is honoring Paul Tyler for his support of the museum.
Mark Vukovich went to Iowa State University and got a major in business and minor in economics. He has retired from being CEO of the Blank Park Zoo for 11 years. He was an auto dealer and owned Dewey Ford in Des Moines, but sold it.
He loves history, and if he goes on vacation, he stops anywhere with a plaque. He loves traveling and visiting small museums. He's involved with charities like ACCI, is a YMC annual campaign director, and has 2 hunting dogs. He's also involved in the church. He loves to ski and bike and has lived in Des Moines ever since he was 7.
Why is Fort Des Moines Museum and Education Center important to you?
It's important to me because I think it's now 100 years old, the event that we're talking about. And I think that people in America tend to only focus on what's going on around them and not look back at history and what history means. And I don't think you can afford to let history slip away, especially important history. I mean, you have the first Black officers, you have the last cavalry action against the Indians, you have all those women whacks that came through in World War II. And I think that needs to be preserved, because 50 or 100 years from now, that may be the only kind of places where you can actually see and witness that history.
What do you think the museum offers to the community?
Iowa doesn't have very many important historical sites. We were an agricultural state, very small towns, other than like the Spirit Lake massacre up in Spirit Lake. And there's a little way down near Keokuk, there was a Civil War battle kind of that ebbed into Iowa. We don't have a lot of, and some historians would say I'm wrong about that, kinds of things. And if you look at the Metro Des Moines community, you have Hoyt Sherman Place, where Sherman's brother from the Civil War general, started that. You have Salisbury House, which was the guy that started the perfume industry in Iowa. And I know there's the Dodge House in Council Bluffs, and the Belvedere House in Cedar Rapids, but there's not really very many historic sites. When you go, like if you drive through Vermont, it can take all day to drive 200 miles, because you can stop every 20 miles and see an historical site in regards to the Revolutionary War. And if you guys ever been to Virginia, every 50 miles there's a Civil War battlefield that could take all day to go through, and we just don't have that. And what the Fort Des Moines represents is really unique, not just to our community, but to the nation as a community.
What are your hopes for the future of the museum?
I've talked to your dad a lot about that, and static museums are disappearing every day. And of course, I don't know how much he's talked to you guys. A static museum is a museum where there's not a lot of computer interaction. There's not a lot of things you can touch or feel, like the Science Center. It's where you have to go stand in front of a glass case and read. And the Fort Museum is really pretty, there's a couple of videos, but basically it is a static museum. If you have attention deficit disorder, ADD, you'll have trouble in the Fort Museum, because there's a lot to read and a lot of just still things to look at. And I think my hope for the Fort Museum, if I had unlimited money or could force the state to be, we need to upgrade the Fort Museum so the average 17-year-old can have some more interactive experiences to make them want to stay there or go there or be there longer. Long term, the museum is not big enough, and we've talked about that. Your dad and I have, about visiting exhibits. The Smithsonian has a whole bunch of visiting exhibits, and if you've ever been to the President Hoover's house in eastern Iowa, that's really static. I mean, he was president from 1928 to 1932. There's a picture. There's an Oval Office, like it was. And once you go once, there's no reason to go back, because you've seen it all. And what the heck? But they have been bringing in like a traveling president's exhibit, where they had Lincoln's chair and stovepipe hat. They had something from each president. And they told what it was, and we drove over to see that exhibit because it was a traveling exhibit that was really interesting about the presidents. I wouldn't have driven over to see Hoover's museum again. And I think what needs to happen with the Fort Des Moines Museum is figuring out how to provide space so you could get a traveling exhibit from Smithsonian on the Buffalo Soldiers, which relates directly to what the Fort Museum did. It's the Black troops in the Civil War, but there's not enough space to put that traveling exhibit in. And so my hope would be to figure out a way to create space or add on or do something in rearranging the current exhibit so you could have traveling exhibits come. So you'd be willing to go back again next year because it's a different traveling exhibit that's in the museum.
Fort Des Moines Museum and Education Center is honoring Mark Vukovich for his support of the museum.
Commander Carlton G. Philpott is a 24-and-a-half-year veteran of the Navy. His last active duty assignment was an instructor at the Army's Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth. When he retired in 1994, in May 2015, after 13 years, he retired as assistant professor in the business department at the University of St. Mary's in Leavenworth, Kansas, and as an adjacent professor at Columbia College and Webster University.
For more than 30 years, he continues as the chairman and project director of the Buffalo Soldier Educational Historical Committee. He has honored these patriotic Americans through building monuments. Commander Philpott and various committees have spearheaded the construction of 7 monuments at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Most recently, a monument honoring the All-Black Woman Army Corps WAC Unit 6880th Central Postal Directory Battalion, and was dedicated on November 30th, 2018 at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas.
Can you share with us the significance of the 6888 Postal Battalion?
Yes, the 6888 Central Directory Postal Battalion is important for several reasons. First of all, they set many records, and mainly they opened the door for African American women to serve in the Army and the military on a large scale. This unit of 855 women were the first unit of Black women Army Corps units to deploy overseas during World War II at any time prior to World War II. And because of their outstanding record of breaking all Army records, sorting mail, this left a favorable impression on the military in this country that Black women could serve in the military. Now, nurses, Black nurses and other smaller units had deployed prior to the 688. There's a Black nursing unit that went to Africa in 1943. Another couple of nursing units went to Europe before the 688 got there in February of 1945. And they're important because their story needs to be told. They broke all Army records sorting mail. They served in 3 places in Europe: Birmingham, England, Paris, France, and another place. The Army, when they got to England, mail had not been delivered to the soldiers and civilians in almost 2 to 3 years. And this mail was stacked in large aircraft-sized warehouses. It was cold, wet, dingy, dark, rat-infested, stinky. Imagine food that had been sent to to the service members by their family. And so the Army gave them 6 months to sort the mail in Birmingham, England. What they did, though, they finished it in 3 months. Now, the average other postal units before them, white postal units, records showed on one picture, they sorted 624,000 letters in 1 month in December 1944. The 688 sorted 65,000 every 8 hours. And so in the period of about 90 days, they sorted almost 18 million pieces of mail in packages, and they repackaged some. Imagine not knowing whether your family, you have a baby, status of your mother, your father, status of your wife and family members, and not being able to get in the mail. So they opened the door and paved the way for other African Americans to be deployed and to serve in the United States military.
We are honoring all the members of the 6,888 and would like to know if any of them are still living.
Right, there are 7 that are still living that we know of. We located a total of 14. And one is 101 and a half, and another one is almost 102. The one in New York at 100, she survived COVID. I've never met her. There's another one that's 101, almost and a half, that she lives in Montgomery, Alabama. She just stopped working for Winn-Dixie in March, and she was still driving to work every day. And I was told she speeds a lot. And she was on national TV, Good Morning America, a few months ago. She got a black belt in karate around the age of 70. Her husband was a Tuskegee Airman mechanic, and he went on a secret mission for the Army. And so the other ones, one of them is Wisconsin, California. So we have 7 living right now that we know of.
What role did Fort Des Moines have in the legacy of the 6,888?
688.
Yes.
That Fort Des Moines has a lot of history as far as blacks in the military, number one. And it also for women in the military. Back in World War I, the first Black officer candidate school was in Fort Des Moines. And a lot of those men came back, became lawyers, doctors, judges, and stuff that way. Now for the women, the 688, that was the first place, 2 things. Officers trained there and enlisted people trained, women trained there. And the first officer candidate school for women in the Army was at Fort Des Moines. There were 400 women in that first class. And according to an agreement made between Mary McLeod Bethune and Roosevelt, 10% in civilian black leaders of everything that the Army did with women had to include blacks. And so that first class had 40 women selected. Mary McLeod Bethune handpicked those 40. Of the 40, 39 showed up at Fort Des Moines, and all of them graduated on August 29th, 1942. The commanding for the 688 was in that class. Her name was Charity Adams. Ironically, Charity Adams' name was the first name on the graduation list. In the military, you are commissioned or made an officer based on an alphabetical list. And so Charity's name was at the top of the list. For some particular reason, now the program has been printed up. And for some particular reason, young ladies, instead of commissioning people alphabetically, in which Charity Adams has been the first woman commissioned as an officer in the United States Army, they decided to commission them by groups. And of all the women there, the black women was the only one that segregated from the other women. So all the black women was in one group. And so Charity Adams was not the first woman commissioned in the Army. I have not found out the reason why. Also, Charity Adams became the first Black woman commissioned in the Army. And as she trained enlisted soldiers, women soldiers at Fort Des Moines. And Fort Des Moines also had the first all-Black band. And so Charity Adams became the first commanding officer of the 688 while they were in Birmingham, England. So Fort Des Moines has a great rich history and a story to be told. It's a beautiful museum. I've been there. It's beautiful. Anything else?
How do you see Fort Des Moines Museum contributing to the legacy of 600 or 688?
It is in a significant way. What this first, it is the place that opened the door for Black women to serve in the military. And that story needs to be told. I think in the museum, they have the picture of the first Black female jet pilot in the Navy. I've spoken with her a couple of times. There's a Black woman who was the only Black woman to fly a spy plane. She's an Air Force colonel. She started out in the Navy. And so it has a unique history, and it needs to be told, and it needs to be preserved. And I hope that the community and those around will raise enough money to keep it active. I know your father's doing a great job, and it's been very challenging for him and the board of directors. And so he was very encouraging with me when I started the project for the 688 monument. Have you seen it, pictures of it? When you come into Leavenworth to see it. Yeah, when you come to Leavenworth to see it. See the monument.
When am I going to see it?
And when are you coming to Leavenworth to visit the monument?
I've only seen pictures of it. I have no idea when we would go in person to see it.
Just for your information, I don't know whether it's part of this or not, there's a group called Wish for Life, and there are about 3 or 4 688 veterans that we know of that have not seen the monument. And this Wish for Life grant wishes for any veteran 65 and over. You don't have to be dying. So they've already agreed to bring one lady from Jacksonville to the monument, and we were requested for 2 others. And hopefully, if that's the case, we're planning to bring them to Fort Leavenworth sometime in September. We hope we can do that. They pay all the expenses and everything.
Fort Des Moines Museum and Education Center is honoring Lieutenant Commander Carlton Philpott for all his work in honoring the Buffalo Soldiers and all those who came after them,
and especially his dedication and commitment to honoring the 6,888th service members and establishing a monument in their honor at Fort Leavenworth. And here to help us inform and appreciate the 8,888th Postal Battalion, we have Lacey Opdyke.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Lacey Opdyke, and I'm a recent graduate of the History Master's Program and Cultural Museum Studies Graduate Certificate Program at Eastern Michigan University. Tonight, I'm ecstatic to talk with you about a crucially important piece of history, a unit of young Black women known as the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion within the Women's Army Corps. But first, let me give you a brief background on the Women's Army Corps itself. On December 30th, 1941, Congresswoman Edith Norris Rogers introduced H.R. 6293 to the Committee on Military Affairs with the purpose of establishing a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Earlier the same year, she proposed a similar bill, but without the immediate need for more military personnel prior to Pearl Harbor, Congress didn't see the importance of women's abilities to free men to fight. However, it became evident after the violent attack that total war was imminent and manpower shortages would soon come. On May 14, 1942, Congress approved the creation of the WAAC, WAC. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the bill into law the following day, and on the 16th, Oveta Culp-Hobby, a successful politician and journalist from Texas who served as the head of the Women's Interest Section in the War Department Bureau of Public Relations, was sworn in as the very first director of the Women's Army Corps. So Hobby's first task as the new director was finding an appropriate location for the WAC Training Center, the very first one, as soon as possible. For this, Fort Des Moines, Iowa was chosen. Roughly 35,000 women applied to become WACs with only 1,000 slots open. The first group of 440 women arrived for Officer Candidate School in July of 1942, July 20th to be exact. Of the 440 women, 40 were Black women. When the Corps was established, it was understood that the recruitment efforts would follow that of the armies, including what is known as the 10% rule. The Army's quote-unquote goal was to have 10.6% of their forces be African American to reflect the overall population of the country. It was also clearly defined that there would be no discrimination in the types of jobs that African American women would be assigned, although the segregation of and discrimination against Black WACs still occurred. The NAACP, the National Board of the YWCA, the Boston Urban League, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune all objected to segregation and argued that the policy of segregation would deter the best qualified African American women who wished to serve within the WAC. But for years, these requests were ignored. In 1943, the Army began receiving more requests from its units for WAC personnel than it could provide. As a result, Representative Rogers proposed bills in both the House and the Senate that allowed for the Army to convert the WAC from a force that served beside the Army to a force that served in the Army. WACs were also desperately needed overseas. If they became full members of the Army, they would be completely protected if injured or captured while overseas. The plans for an Allied invasion were underway, and with it came a need for increased manpower. WACs could provide this additional manpower, effectively freeing a man to fight. So, on July 1st, 1943, President Roosevelt signed a bill converting the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps to the Women's Army Corps, or the WAC. By late 1944, with the successful Allied invasion of Normandy, a new problem prevailed. Warehouses in England and France were stacked with millions of pieces of mail addressed to overseas personnel. However, manpower shortages were still a continuing issue. So, who could take on this momentous task of sorting and sending mail? Well, with the success of several units of white WACs being sent overseas, civil rights advocates pushed for the same opportunities for black WACs to be sent overseas. On January 15, 1945, the War Department announced that African American WACs would finally be organized into a battalion for overseas service. 824 enlisted women and 31 officers were drawn together from all forces of the WAC and designated as the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, or the 6888 as their nickname prevails today. By this time, members of the 6888 were already in extended field service training or overseas training at Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, where they, quote, crawled under logs wearing gas masks and jumped over trenches. They also learned how to identify enemy aircraft, climb ropes, board and evacuate ships, and endured mile-long marches with 30-pound rucksacks. Though the War Department knew what their assignment was, these women would only learn that they were assigned to postal work after their arrival in the European Theater of Operations. The 6888 was led by Lieutenant Colonel Charity Adams Early, a graduate of the very first officer candidate class here at Fort Des Moines. After her commissioning on August 29, 1942, she remained at Fort Des Moines working as a staff training officer, a station control officer, and a company commander. In September of 1943, she was promoted to major, making her the highest-ranking female officer at Fort Des Moines. By late 1944, Early was chosen to be the commanding officer of the 6888. She and other African-American WACs at Fort Des Moines were ordered to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, to begin training for overseas service. At first, she was hesitant, afraid that the position might be a little too difficult or over her head. However, she took on the mission with great determination. The first contingent of the battalion arrived in Glasgow, Scotland on February 14, 1945, where they encountered their very first experience with war. A German V-1 rocket landed and exploded near their dock. Thankfully, none of them were injured. From here, the women boarded a train to Birmingham, England. 50 days later, a second contingent sailed for Britain as well and were desperately needed. When they arrived at their post, they were confronted with warehouses stacked from floor to ceiling with mail and packages. Excuse me. Eventually, the battalion was split into 4 companies. They worked 24 hours around the clock, 7 days a week in 8-hour shifts, within dimly lit, filthy, and cold warehouses. According to the New York Times, each shift of women processed roughly 65,000 pieces of mail. And this was no easy task, as the women soon found out that much of the mail was missing key information, like Army serial numbers and full names on the parcels and mail letters. They developed an informational system containing approximately 7 million cards full of information on soldiers across the ETO, investigated packages that weren't addressed correctly, dealt with undeliverable mail, and even had the sad task of returning mail belonging to those who lost their lives in service. When battling an enormous backlog of mail, poor working conditions, and exhaustion, women of the 6AAA also dealt with dual segregation. Not only were they required to sleep in separate housing because of their gender, but they were also delegated to separate housing, an old boarding school in England, for example, from their white female counterparts. These women also took on separate roles in order to operate their own mess hall and other facilities due to segregation. Despite this blatant segregation and discrimination, the 6AAA were extremely successful as a unit. In Birmingham, they cleared a 6-month backlog of mail in about 3 months. By this time, they developed a motto to keep them inspired: no mail, low morale. By this point in the war, keeping morale high was of utmost importance, and the 6AAA were serious about their mission. On June 9, 1945, after successfully clearing a 6-month backlog of mail in only 3 months, WACs of the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion sailed to France from Birmingham. Arriving in Le Havre, they boarded a train for Rouen, France. Once again, they were confronted with a massive backlog of mail stacked in warehouses. Working around the clock with French civilians and German POWs, they cleared the backlog once again. In Rouen, the 6AAA lost 3 of its members after a Jeep accident on July 8, 1945. Private First Class Mary J. Barlow and Private First Class Mary H. Bankston were killed in the accident, and Sergeant Dolores M. Brown died from her injuries days later. Funeral services were not covered by the War Department. The 6888th pooled their resources in order to honor their sisters. Luckily, 3 members had experience with mortuary work and were able to take care of their bodies. Major Adams wrote to inform their families, and a funeral was held. The 3 women were buried with honors in the Normandy American Cemetery. Today, they are 3 of only 4 women buried here. The other woman is a Red Cross worker. In October 1945, they moved to Paris. Here, officers were housed in one hotel, and the enlisted women were housed in a separate hotel. As the war came to an end, their force was reduced by 300 women. While in Paris, they still handled mail, but morale of the battalion became a problem as the workload increased at times, but with fewer personnel. Shortly after, in December 1945, Major Adams and a majority of her battalion sailed back to the United States. Major Adams was promoted to lieutenant colonel, becoming the first Black woman to achieve this rank. She was discharged in 1946, and she continued on with her graduate education. It is important to note that when other women of the 6AAA arrived back in the United States and the battalion was disbanded at Fort Dix, New Jersey, there were no celebrations, no parades, and no official recognition of their accomplishments as the very first and only Black unit to serve overseas during the war. In fact, the Army itself would not be desegregated until July of 1948. In the early 1980s, a few 6AAA veterans returned to Birmingham, England, and were celebrated by the city's mayor. After this visit, recognition of the unit increased, and they have been featured by Smithsonian Institution's National Postal Museum and the Women in Military Service for American Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, to name just a few. As the only female African American battalion to serve overseas during the Second World War, the 6AAA's history is crucial in understanding the narrative of African American women in wartime America. These women battled intersectional discrimination as a result of their gender and their race, and proved their immense success time and time again. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to learn about the 6888, to listen to my presentation, and for supporting the Fort Des Moines Museum and Education Center. Have an excellent night.
6,888th Battalion is a very important part of our history. It helped boost the morale of millions of Americans during World War II and plays a very important role in our history, and we would like to celebrate and honor the first all-black battalion of the Women's Army Corps. Please take note of the future Fort Des Moines Museum events. We hope that you will participate in our annual Massing of the Colors, always on the first Saturday of November at 11 in the morning. In collaboration with the Des Moines Radio Amateurs Association, we participated in the International Museums Weekend in June and will be participating in Scouting's Jamboree on the air in October. We are also looking forward to our first holiday tea and welcoming in the new year, with many more exciting programs and events. To stay updated, visit the Fort Des Moines Museum Facebook page you see here on the screen.
I'd like to thank you again for participating in the first ever Fort Des Moines Museum and Education Center virtual fundraising event. Please look forward to us doing this for a second time next year in 2022 in May. And then before then, I also invite you again to participate in the Massing of the Colors, whether it be virtual or with your presence on the first Saturday in November. Thank you very much.